So where do the values assigned to elements come from is the question before us. Of course, we've already talked about this. Way back in Unit 2, I compared elements and values to Mad Libs, or really any form that you have to fill out, a job application or a form at the doctor's office. Anything where you have a field where you have to fill in a value. An element is the field that you have to fill in, and the value is what you choose to fill that field in with. Or, more accurately, an element is a category of statement, and a value is the data that you provide in that statement. So, how are those values decided? In Dublin Core and most other metadata schemas, there are recommendations for how to select values. For example, and again, we've looked at this before, for coverage in Dublin Core, there is a recommendation for using the thesaurus of geographic names. For date, there is a recommendation to use ISO 8601. These are not required, these are just recommendations, but there they are. On the other hand, you can have title where there are no recommendations for how to fill that out. You want an open text field where you can fill in any value at all. Where author or creator in Dublin Core, you might have an authority list of names. So metadata schemas have recommendations for how to select values often. Now let's take a look at an example of a metadata record, another record from Europeana. So this is, again, just one of the many records in Europeana. It's a record for a piece of art called Scene in a Street Outside a South Indian Temple. And notice that there is this very long narrative description and then a set of elements and values here. And let's take a look at that same record on the British Library's website, where you get all of the same data, except you also get an image of the actual painting. Now, the narrative description of this painting reads like a subject expert wrote it. The scene depicts a large entrance gopura to a Hindu temple, faces a village street, painted almost entirely in the English manner. Gopuras, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, are huge pyramidal entrance towers, etc., etc. As I say, it reads like someone who knows something about this style of architecture and the style of painting wrote that narrative description. Not to mention that you get the dimensions of the original piece of art itself, which means that somebody must have stood there at some point in time with a ruler and measured the dimensions of the thing. This metadata record, the one on the British Library's site, as well as the Europeana site, because of course that is a harvest of the British Library's record, this metadata record has the hallmark of a record that was lovingly handcrafted, which makes sense when what you want is a really rich and full description of a resource, for example, this particular painting. Now, the problem with lovingly handcrafted metadata records or anything else is that it's expensive. And I don't mean just expensive in terms of money, I mean expensive in terms of time and human effort. Someone had to spend however long it took to create that metadata record, and very likely that person was a subject expert, and subject experts tend to command higher salaries than just, an intern or whatnot. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that it took 10 minutes to create this metadata record, and I suspect that's a lowball estimate. So in an 8-hour workday, at 10 minutes per metadata record, you can create, 48 metadata records if you don't take time off for lunch. And how many images are there in the British Library's collection exactly? I actually tried to look this up and I couldn't find an estimate for the number of images, but I found an estimate of approximately 150 million items in the British Library's collection total. So at 10 minutes per metadata record for 150 million items, that's on the order of 3,000 years to create metadata records for all of the items in the British Library. That's really just not going to be feasible, right? Even if you have a team of people creating metadata records, it's still going to take you a long time. Maybe you can get it down to a few hundred years. Clearly, this is not going to work. Lovingly handcrafted metadata is time-consuming and expensive to produce. So the question is, what other options do we have?